Carson in Iowa. A post-debate poll of likely Republican caucus goers shows Trump making a comeback. Trump is up 2 points over Carson, 25% to 23%, while Marco Rubio is at third in 13%. Joe.
Yeah, Mark Halperin, two big takeaways here. Donald Trump once again showing resilience. As Alex Castellano said, he became a believer when Trump fell and then jumped back up. It appears to be happening again. Donald Trump, again, getting a second and third win. I see, more importantly, though, the two numbers in that poll that right now really should concern Chris Christie, and that's the fact that the last debate performance have pushed both Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz up to third and fourth place in that poll. Jeb Bush down at 5%. He really should go ahead, leave Iowa, give up on it, and go to New Hampshire. But debates matter. Marco's debate, Ted's debate last time matter. They're now a strong third and a strong fourth. So we've got that Trump story, but also the rise of these two people that had great debates last time.
You'd have to say today, looking at that poll and the other polls that have come out in the last week, that there are three leading contenders for the nomination right now: Trump, Cruz, and Rubio. And that Rubio, as the only establishment candidate in that field right now, doesn't quite control his own destiny. But he is well positioned now. Some other establishment candidate, Christie, Kasich, or Bush, will have to stop Marco Rubio, or he will be the establishment finalist on this trajectory. And Trump controls his own destiny. If Trump performs, he will be the nominee.
And I will also say anecdotally, what has surprised me is how consistently, when I ask people if it's not Ben Carson who they would vote for, Cruz, by far, the number of people.
Joe, jump in.
Yeah, you know, the thing is, if just putting it bluntly, you talked about three-dimensional chess, Mark Halperin. If Ted Cruz is to win, Ben Carson must fall.
That's right.
If something happens where Ben Carson's support evaporates, Ted Cruz suddenly becomes a guy that I can't even compare him to Secretariat, like a horse that breaks late and breaks hard. Don't you agree with Chris? If Ben Carson steps on his tongue one time too many and he collapses, it is Ted Cruz that's going to suddenly become a strong establishment candidate.
I think Ted Cruz continues to be the most undervalued stock in this thing. And I asked a bunch of the top Republican strategists in the country 2 nights ago. I surveyed a whole bunch of them and said, who's in this now? Who's a finalist? And even some of them who do not like Ted Cruz personally, even some of them who think Ted Cruz would have a hard time winning a general election, even some of them who do not want Ted Cruz to be the nominee said today he is the most likely Republican nominee.
But he's not an
I've got to say,
candidate.
Mika, I got to say that, though, Mika, we're saying that about Ted Cruz. Right now, the headline of this poll, at least, is Donald Trump has turned it around once again. He confounds critics. I spoke to a group of Republicans last night. He confounds Republicans. And yet, this is a guy they're starting to understand. I spoke to a lot of establishment Republicans last night who can't figure out why he's winning, but are starting to believe he just may be the nominee.
Yeah, I think pundits need to watch the debates like viewers, not like pundits, because they keep getting it wrong on his debate performances. It's kind of fascinating. Still ahead on Morning Joe, he's one of the most powerful men in Congress. And tonight, he's hosting the Democratic presidential candidates in his home state of South Carolina. Congressman Jim Clyburn joins us. But first, the past as prologue, how Bush 41's comments about his son's presidency sparked a fight in the Republican Party. Andrea Mitchell is standing by with that story. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
And I know you often are.
Yes, well, we turn to you for information.
A lonely nation.
Yeah.
Moments of gravitas.
Yes, there's that. And also just facts.
But only moments.
Exactly. Small,
They're
momentary.
brief.
Ben Carson
moments.
responded to criticism yesterday over comments he made that pyramids were built by the big biblical figure Joseph to store grain and not as burial tombs for Egyptian pharaohs.
Some people believe in the Bible, like I do, and don't find that to be silly at all, and believe that God created the earth and don't find that to be silly at all. The secular progressives try to ridicule it anytime it comes up, and they're welcome to do that.
Carson was also criticized about his claims about American history. In a Facebook post on Wednesday, Carson compared his lack of political experience to the Founding Fathers. Quote, every signer of the Declaration of Independence had no elected office experience. What they had was a deep belief that freedom is a gift from God. That claim was rated false by the Washington Post, and Carson changed the Post to say they had no experience in federal office, though at the time the federal government did not exist. Carson was also under scrutiny for reported discrepancies in his life story, particularly about violent episodes in his youth before he turned to religion, including the attempted stabbing of a friend named Bob, which he wrote about in his best-selling autobiography. But a number of Carson's childhood friends told CNN they had no recollection of him being hot-tempered or violent, leading Carson to acknowledge that some of the names were, well, they were made up.
I don't want to expose people without their knowledge, but remember, when I was 14, when the knifing episode occurred, that's when I changed. That's when most of those people they talked to began to know who I was. They didn't know me before that. One of the ones where I threw a rock and broke someone's glasses, that occurred when I was maybe about 7 or 8. The attempted stabbing incident occurred when I was 13 or 14. Trying to hit my mother in the head with a hammer, that was around the same time as the stabbing incident. Unless they were there at that time, why would they know about that? That's very silly. Everybody has childhood memories of things that they do that other people, unless they were specifically involved, would know about. I mean, I don't know why that's hard for people to understand.
I never use the true names of people in books, to protect the innocent. That's something that people have done for decades, for centuries. That's something that's commonly done. The person that I tried to stab, I talked to today, said would they want to be revealed. They were not anxious to be revealed. And it was a close relative of mine, and I didn't want to put their lives under the spotlight. This is something that I've decided to do.
So, Joe, I guess first of all, I'm told he didn't actually say in the book that these are fake names to protect the innocent or to protect people that he doesn't want to expose. Right. Carson went on to say, I would say to the people of America, do you think I'm a pathological liar like CNN does, or do you think I'm an honest person? What are we supposed to think?
Well, first of all, his story seems to keep changing about exactly what happened, when it happened, where it happened. I don't think that matters at the end of the day. I think more importantly, you have, Mark Halpern, the question of whether this guy's just a little quirky, whether he has the temperament, whether he has the character to be president of the United States. You follow up a story about a stabbing that now appears to be inconsistent, and a lot of different stories where you're making up names in your book, and then you talk about the pyramids being made by biblical figures, even though the Bible, which we Christians say is one of the most important historical documents of ancient times, never mentions things like that. And he talks about secular progressives and people who don't believe in God questioning his pyramid theory. Well, I'm a Southern Baptist, and I was raised in the Southern Baptist Church, and spent about 3 or 4 days at church reading the Bible and in church, and was literally raised in the Southern Baptist Church. I don't believe his theory. It's crazy, and in my 50 years in churches, I've never heard this theory before. So I don't know that the secular progressive attack sticks, Mark Halpern. There's a bigger question, though. There's a lot of quirkiness going on here. Does that impact voters any more than some of Ronald Reagan's statements in 1976 and 1980 impacted him with the voters when he said things that weren't factually sound?
Well, I think you framed it just right. The words like quirky and inconsistent. This is, again, a crazy cycle. Can Ben Carson being this inconsistent and having this many questions raised for people, still be the Republican nominee? I actually think he can be if no one else rises up as a strong challenger. But there are other strong candidates in this field who will challenge him. And I think he's going to have to not just address these individual things, which he's done over the last couple of days, but I think he's going to have to send reassurance to people, not just in the establishment, but even some of his grassroots supporters, that this isn't part of some pattern of a trouble with the truth, or a pattern of carelessness, or a pattern of exaggeration that speaks to larger issues about his character. I'm not saying it does, but he's got to reassure people that it doesn't.
But John Meacham, you and I obviously remember, because you're such an old man, such a learned man.
Wise.
We remember some of the things that Ronald Reagan said in 1976 in his campaign against Jerry Ford, and in 1980 against Jimmy Carter. And Reagan was obviously my political hero. He inspired me, along with people like John Kasich, to get into politics. But Reagan would go around saying things like trees are the largest emitter of carbon dioxide on the planet. And his critics would mock and ridicule and laugh. And again, I love this story. They would hang signs around trees wherever Reagan went for campaign speeches saying, "Stop me before I kill again." His supporters did not care. And the question is, will Ben Carson's care?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the analogy is apples and oranges, because by the time Reagan was taking those things, Barbara Bush once referred to them as Reagan's glitches. By the time he was taking those national, he had been a two-term governor of California. He delivered the most memorable speech on behalf of Barry Goldwater in 1964. He had spent 10 years on the road for General Electric, reading Human Events, reading National Review, reading all these newspapers, which, frankly, that's where a lot of the facts got into his head. One of the things about Reagan that people don't appreciate is he probably had something close to a photographic memory. Yeah. So if it was right or it were wrong, it was going to be in there. And I just think that Carson as Reagan is probably not the analogy we want.
Let me get a couple more stories.
You know, actually, Mika, I was actually trying to be charitable. How's that?
Real quick, then. Yeah, jump in.
I had to say that, so all Carson people didn't say I was a secular humanist or something like that. So I threw the Reagan analogy out there, and I'm very glad that John Meacham put a needle in it, as most conservatives would do.
All right, I want to get a couple more stories in
I've done my job being
get
nice
to Kristen as well. Let's jump into one of the big headlines of the morning. Tuesday's Republican presidential debate is going to look a little bit different from the first three, with two candidates bumped down from the main stage and two others failing to make the cutoff for the undercard. I think further raising questions about how this is working. Not that there's an easy way to put on these debates, but I'm not sure well, listen to this. Fox Business Network announced the 8-person lineup for Tuesday's primetime debate. Two of the previous competitors, New Jersey Governor Chris Christie and former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee, who won the Iowa caucuses in 2008, are now in the earlier 7 p.m. contest. And 3-term Senator Lindsey Graham and 3-term Governor George Pataki of New York are out of the debates entirely. The staging is based on 4 of the most recent national polls, but critics note that Senator Graham's name was not even listed in the NBC News Wall Street Journal poll. Now, Jeb Bush tweeted that he disagrees with rules that prevent Graham's voice from being heard. Quote, his foreign policy message is an important one in particular. And campaigning in New Hampshire before the decision yesterday, Chris Christie said he would be undeterred.
I'm going to be debating somebody on Tuesday night, whether it's the folks I've been debating with before or some other folks. I don't really care in one respect. Put a podium out here on the lawn in front of the foliage, and let's get a few people out here. I'll debate them here. There's 90+ days to go to New Hampshire. We're moving numbers here in New Hampshire, and we're just going to keep working hard.
And Jennifer Horn, the chair of the New Hampshire Republican Party, tweeted yesterday, national polls are a measure of name ID. Chris Christie is polling in the top tier and the first in the nation in primary and working hard. He should be on the main stage. Joe, I agree. What do you think?
I think it's pretty stunning. You look at how Chris Christie's been doing over the past week. Look at the campaign. Look at the fact he has a video out that is viral. that's got millions and millions of hits. Look at the fact, as Jennifer Horn, the chairwoman of the New Hampshire Republican Party, said, this guy is in the top tier in the first in the nation primary, the most important primary in America, and along with Marco Rubio is actually moving faster up to the top than any other candidate. And yet he's knocked out of a debate where, and I mean no disrespect to Rand Paul, but you have Rand Paul, who has literally sold 500 books in the first 2 weeks of his publication. Mark Halperin, this debate process just got stranger. You know, CNN figured out a way to get Carly Fiorina in their debate when she had the hot hand. Everybody assumed that the hottest guy in New Hampshire and one of the hottest guys in social media this week would also get in. This is a decision that is flabbergasted.
Mark.
Well, I mean, in a normal cycle, this would be maybe not a death knell, but close to it for Christie. But it's not a normal cycle. And I think that while I agree with you that they should have found a way to get Christie on the stage, I don't think it's going to hurt him as much as some people do. He does have a fundraising problem, and he needs to keep that together. But I think right now, while it's unfortunate, and I think keeping Lindsey Graham off the stage completely is also a mistake, this is not something that's going to stop Chris Christie's presidential campaign. I think he may even be able to turn it to his advantage.
He might be able to, John Meacham, but what's your take, though, on what's happening with this field? Because you do have Chris Christie at least, you know, we were playing, I don't know if you saw the Facebook video of him talking about addiction in New Hampshire that was shot by the Huffington Post, but has really gone viral. I was watching over the course of 2 shows here on Morning Joe, pundits and, you know, folks from the intelligentsia class watching this video for the first time and their mouths dropping open. Right. Like, this is the candidate. This is the moment. And yet there's this process that's completely separate from how people feel or what is happening in the moment that is getting these men and some women on and off the main stage. Couldn't there be a better way to do it?
Well, almost certainly it becomes much more subjective, but politics by definition is subjective. So you're trying to impose an objective standard with these averages of polls on something that we know historically where people are in the polls on November, whatever it is.
There's this argument: polls mean nothing. Polls mean this. Well, how does it determine?
They don't mean nothing, but they don't have
coverage.
It's a factor, but it should not be the factor.
It shouldn't be the factor. Or maybe they go state by state, Joe.
Well, you know, again, you have to look and see. We've always said, anybody that knows how politics works, these national polls are beauty contests. The question is, how are you doing in Iowa? How are you doing in New Hampshire? How are you doing in South Carolina? And how are you doing in your home state? Those are the best indicators. I think also, Caddy K, one of the things that's so stunning is Chris Christie was actually kept out because of a poll by Investors Business Daily, which was rated the worst poll, the worst polling outfit in all of the 2012 campaign. So you talk about a sample that's not, and we're not carrying Chris Christie's water. None other than Nate Silver, my dear and close and personal friend Nate Silver, who I've been in fights with forever. Nate was the guy that scored them the absolute worst, and every professional polling outfit agrees. And yet this is keeping the guy with the hottest hand off the debate stage.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of questions about why they chose Investors Daily over, for example, the CBS New York Times poll, right, which most people might have thought was a more recognized, respectable poll, and yet that wasn't even in the makeup. I think, you know, the other thing that we haven't mentioned is the fact that Lindsey Graham isn't on any stage in this debate. The day before Veterans Day, the only candidates that served in the U.S. military doesn't get a chance to debate. I think that's a PR miss for the Republican Party and for the Fox News holding this. I can't see how they don't regret that one.
All right, moving on. I'm glad we have a historian here.
Back to Morning Joe. Now let's bring in a good friend of mine from Rock Hill, South Carolina, and a man that can't walk into Lizard's Thicket anywhere across the state without being hugged on and loved. You got a little get-together going on this morning, Jim. Tell us all about it. You got it, not this morning, but y'all are getting ready this morning. Tell me all about it. Sounds exciting.
Well, it is very exciting. Thank you so much for having us, and thank you so much for being here in South Carolina. As you know, Winthrop University, the Winthrop University Eagles, same mascot as my high school, Mather Academy. I've had a real loving experience with this university. The first honorary doctorate that I ever received in my life came from this university when it was celebrating its centennial, 100 years of existence. One of the buildings we'll be operating in here today is named for Lois West, the wife of John West, who brought me into politics back in 1970. So to be able to host this event here at this university is one of the highlights of my political career.
Nice. Chris Jensing.
When you get on the campaign trail and you talk to folks, one of the complaints that I hear repeatedly is that there isn't enough depth, there isn't enough conversation about the issues that matter most. And I'm just wondering if you can give a little perspective on what you think can come out of something like this and what the importance of it is as we look at the big picture of this political season.
Well, thanks so much for that question. We, in preparation for this debate, the political arm of my operation has been tweeting out and emailing all of the people who have interacted with us over the years, asking them what it is they would like to have these candidates address. And I was a little bit surprised to see some of the responses. But to sum it up, people are very concerned about income inequality, what we're going to do in this country to stop this widening gap between the haves and the have-nots or have-littles. They are very concerned about the security of the country, asking questions, wanting to hear answers about what a candidate would do to keep the country safe. They do believe that we ought to have a minimum wage that is more livable than that which we currently have. And so I would hope that the questions this evening will engender some responses that's a little more substantive and a little more aspirational for voters than some of what I heard at the last Republican debate.
There you go. Bianna?
Congressman, I'd like to pick up on that because we're just moments away from a very important jobs report. On paper, the economy looks like it's doing just fine at 5.1% unemployment rate. They're expecting 180,000 jobs have been created. But I'm curious to know what your constituents and the folks there in South Carolina feel about their bottom line and how they feel about the economy, specifically when it comes to wages.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they believe that the country is on the rebound. They believe that the country is doing well. They don't see where their communities are doing as well as they should. Remember, the investor class is being taken care of with all of the policies that we put forth. The fact of the matter is, when you look at Wall Street, things are going well. You look at Main Street after Main Street after Main Street, things are not going very well for a lot of the people that we represent here. Look at student costs of education. Student loans now being one of the biggest debts that families have in this country, and people are worried about whether or not they're going to be able to educate their children so that they can function in this global economy that we know they will have to function in. And so that's what the anxiety is all about. Investors doing well, consumers not so well.
All right, we look forward to the conversation. The forum gets underway at 8 o'clock tonight right here on MSNBC. Congressman Jim Clyburn, thank you very much for being on the show this morning.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
47 past the hour. Joining us now, former Treasury official and Morning Joe economic analyst Steve Ratner, anchor for the Blaze TV Amy Holmes, and in Washington, chief White House correspondent for Politico Mike Allen. Okay, let's just go through these charts and everyone can chime in. Just about everybody says they've never seen a Republican primary quite like this one. But as Steve Ratner points out, recent history shows there is still plenty of room for big changes at this stage of the campaign. Anything could happen.
So I thought we'd just run through over a few of the past primaries. I think Mark and lots of other people probably know this, but for others who may not remember as well, you'll see that, in fact, there has been a lot of change even after the 88-day mark, which we just passed with respect to Iowa. So if we go back to 2012 and look at the 2012 Republican side, you'll see that this is roughly the same point in, sorry, let me do that again. This is roughly the same point in time as where we are now. And so you can see that Rick Perry, in fact, had been in the lead for a good while, and just about at this point, I think he had his oops moment somewhere around here, and he began his rather precipitous decline. The red line is Romney, and you can see he sort of stays steady along the way. But if you look at what happens after Rick Perry begins his descent, you had the Herman Cain moment. We all remember when Herman Cain had his brief moment of excitement, and then of course you had the Gingrich moment, where it looked for a while like Newt was going to be the winner. But in the end, each of them had a peak, and then they essentially fell apart by the time that the primary occurred. And of course, we also remember that it was Santorum who, in fact, won this primary, much to everybody's surprise. If you go back to 2008, you can see, again, roughly the 88-day mark is about here. And you can see that Romney was leading pretty much along the way. But then Huckabee began this rise just after this point in time, and ultimately won the primary. What's also kind of amusing, well, let's go to 2008. So if you go to 2008 and the Democrats, what you see is Hillary Clinton leading throughout most of this period again, and the 88-day mark is right around here. You can see Hillary Clinton leading along the way, but then you can see Obama start to come up. And she had actually been in a fight, not with Obama, but with Edwards through most of this period. But in the end, Edwards fell back a bit. Obama ended up winning, and as you remember, Clinton came in third by a relatively small margin. So the point of all this is that things can still change and have changed in the past. And in fact, the other point that everyone here knows is that Iowa is not necessarily a predictor of what will ultimately happen. Neither Santorum nor Huckabee ended up going the distance.
You know, there's a lot of establishment vote up for grabs in Iowa. Trump is currently getting some of it. Carson's getting some of it. Cruz is getting some of it. But none of the establishment candidates have taken off. And whoever wins will obviously get a big deal. Second will get a big deal. Third. It could be that fourth is the biggest deal. The top finishing establishment candidate might end up having the biggest leg up for the nomination.
A family drama is playing out in plain view of the entire country, and it's all because of Meacham. I did not expect this. When you said you were working on this book and you got into a hole and sat there for months and months and months in your pajamas, I thought perhaps
eating Cheetos.
Yeah, you were doing some boring historical diatribe.
I think I advised you that this might not get much interest.
There was a lot. There was skepticism.
Yeah, there's a lot of there. In John's new book, Destiny and Power, former President George H.W. Bush gives a scathing critique of Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld's service in his son's administration. On Cheney, the elder Bush says, quote, he just became very hardline and very different from the Dick Cheney I knew and worked with, referring to Cheney's time as the elder Bush's defense secretary. And the former president had harsher words for his son's first defense secretary, calling Donald Rumsfeld an arrogant fellow. Are you sure that was the word he used?
Can't you hear Dana Carvey saying that?
True. Adding, quote, I don't like what he did, and I think it hurt the president. Rumsfeld has since responded to those critiques, telling NBC News, quote, Bush 41 is getting up in years and misjudges Bush 43, who I found made his own decisions. That is... I'm going to let Joe jump in, but let me just ask you something. How is he doing, and especially how is he doing during these interviews? And is that response by Rumsfeld at all a part of this?
No, it's not. President Bush 41 made these comments in a series of interviews that began in 2008. He continued to reiterate the points as late as 2012. In late 2014, I went back to him with a transcript, and I said, Mr. President, I can't take this off the record, obviously, but if you would like to say I said that in the passion of my son's administration. I've rethought my position. If you want to add any clarification, I'll make a note of that. And he looked me dead in the eye and said, "That's what I said." Vice President Cheney saw these remarks and responds in the book. Secretary Rumsfeld saw what was said about him. He chose not to reply to me on the record. The criticism, President Bush 43 saw all of this and responds in the book. There are no surprises to any of the principles in this. And President Bush knew exactly what he was saying.
Wow.
Okay. I think part of what's going on is a lot of people suspected he thought these things, but he maintained a silence for so long. So the question becomes, why would he have taken this moment to talk about it? And my own view is that as the son's administration was moving into history, Bush 41, who does have a deep interest in history getting things right, he kept a tape-recorded diary, which I draw on all 4 years of his presidency, much of his vice presidency, many of his other jobs. He cares about history. I think he wanted to make the point that his son's administration had an overly hawkish image, and that the style of swagger that he believes that Cheney and Rumsfeld in particular, but also his son, played into, was not a style that would wear particularly well. On the substance of the policies, there's much less distinction. He endorsed the course on Iraq. He wrote his son a letter saying, if the man won't comply, you have to do what you're going to do. They were closer in many ways in terms of the substantive questions, stylistically very different.
Joe, jump in.
But that said, though, this goes all the way back, of course, John Meacham, as you know, into August of 2002, before, 6 months before the war began, when Brent Scowcroft, a man who we all know would never speak out of turn about Bush 43 unless Bush 41 gave the nod. He came out 6 months before the invasion and said, "Don't attack Saddam." So there obviously was a clear antipathy, not only between Rumsfeld and Bush going back to the mid-1970s, but also between the Bush 41 team and the Bush 43 team. In real time. This is not Monday morning quarterbacking. Talk about the split and the divide in real time in the months leading up to the 2003 Iraq War.
Well, it's a distinction about this, how you react to a differing strategic environment, right? I mean, President Bush 41 was dealing with more of a classic balance of power struggle in 1990-91. One country had invaded another country. It threw off the order of the balance of power in the Middle East. It threatened Saudi Arabia. One of the most moving moments in the audio diary is as President Bush is choppering in on Marine One to land on the lawn and say, "This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait." He's dictating. You can hear the blades in the background. And he says, if we don't stop him from going into Saudi Arabia, we could have another world war.
Wow.
That was a classic balance of power war. 2002 is a different kind of thing, and that's what Cheney responds, and that's what President Bush 43 says about this. They believe that they had to project force to change a region, and you have, in that way, it's both a generational and a philosophical difference.
All right.
Because the times were different.
I want to get Caddy and Mark in here, but first, this book, of course, comes out while another Bush is running for president. Her story, a former colleague of Marco Rubio in the Florida legislature, says he was alarmed by his spending. Former state representative Mike Fasano, who donated to Jeb Bush, says it, quote, became very disturbing to me how he was using other people's money. According to CNN, Fasano points to a 2012 Florida State Ethics Commission advocate statement that dismissed a complaint against Rubio, but still found some fault. It dealt with records showing personal spending, including movie tickets, charges to a wine store, a family vacation. Damage to Rubio's minivan and thousands more for a rental car to replace it. Rubio offered explanations for the charges. The wine store actually sold sandwiches. The minivan was damaged by at a Republican Party event. Okay.
Which can get crazy that
can
way.
get crazy, those Republicans. While for other charges, he said he used the wrong credit card in his wallet and eventually reimbursed the party. In dismissing the complaint, the Ethics Commission advocate wrote, quote, when the level of negligence versions exhibited by respondents' confusion between the state party American Express card and his personal MasterCard, together with his failure to recognize the error when reviewing the month's statements and his signature on the reimbursement requests, is disturbing. Meechan, then Kristen. Real quick.
I just want to ask Joe, I mean, you know Florida better than any of us. Is this kind of thing common, not common? How surprised should we be?
Actually, when these stories first came out in 2010 and Marco was actually running for the Senate, I thought, after reading some stories about him, I think it was the Miami Herald or the St. Pete Times, that he was going to be in big trouble because there was a culture in the Florida legislature, especially on the Republican side. You had the Republican chairman at the time, I think he got sent to jail. But you had Marco's successor using the credit card and using GOP money for personal trips to baseball games. And there were none of those clear lines that we were taught in Washington to have, which is you have campaign money, you have professional money, or you have official money, and then you have your personal money, and you just never mix the three. The leaders back in Florida in Rubio's time seemed to be incredibly reckless, and in fact, a friend of mine, a former friend of mine, who succeeded Marco Rubio, actually got indicted, convicted, and I believe spent some time in jail for doing some of the things that Marco was accused of. I will say this, though. I've been hearing since 2010, and I remember telling Kay Poppins this, who was interviewing me about this a while back with BuzzFeed. I've been hearing that Marco, that the other shoe was going to fall from prosecutors and from people behind the scenes since 2010. If the other shoe is ever going to fall, let me just say this has been the longest 5-year step I've ever seen in my life. And if Jeb Bush's people are hoping 5 years later that the other shoe falls, lots of luck. I think this may turn out to be sort of the Benghazi scandal of the GOP primary in that there's a lot of smoke, and you never really find the fire. So, that said, Kristen, Solstice, they still don't have a year's worth of credit cards that Marco's been holding on to for, I guess, 5 years. And this is what the Bush campaign's asking, and a lot of people are asking, why won't he release these credit card records from, I guess, 5 years ago?
I believe they said they were going to go ahead and release all of the records. I think the big question is, did he reimburse for everything or not? If he reimbursed for it, I think this is a little thing that eventually winds up going away because it's not really relevant to what most people care about in this election. But if it does actually seem like there was a misuse of funds and there wasn't reimbursement, I can see this going on a little bit longer. But frankly, I'm with you. I think this is not going to be, if the shoe was going to drop, it would have been dropped by the Charlie Crist people back in that primary in 2010. It wouldn't have waited all this time.
Maybe plays into the youth issue, but yeah. Joining us now, the president of Johns Hopkins University and a professor in the Department of Political Science, Ronald Daniels. How are you doing?
Just great.
Good to have you on board this morning.
Great to have you on board. First of all, we just have to lead with, of course, the big news we've talked about before, but you guys have now moved into the top 10, so to speak, of ranked universities in America and really across the world, considered one of the top 20. What's happened at Johns Hopkins over the past few years that have really caught the attention of a lot of academics?
You know, there's a number of different things. First and foremost has been a focus on undergraduate education, just thinking about the quality of our undergraduate experience, working on facilities, bringing new courses to our students, more seminar opportunities.
Right.
So all of those things are very important, but at the same time, really thinking about how a complex research university like Johns Hopkins can be more responsive to the world in terms of grappling with the big issues. And here, what's been very exciting has been the way in which we have been working at trying to harness different disciplines of the university to collaborate on big challenges in education, in healthcare, in global health, gun violence, and so on.
So that's a huge jump to get into the top 10. 10 in terms of, I know it's been a long fight for you all. You're also in a city that is struggling a great deal. And I know, just full disclosure, my daughter is a student at Hopkins and spent a lot of time after the rioting last spring, working in the community. And there are a lot of different ways you all are trying to bring Baltimore and the Hopkins community together in a positive way. How's it going?
So
given everything,
it's a challenge.
Yeah.
But I think the first thing that we recognize is that so goes Baltimore, so goes Johns Hopkins. So we're very mindful of the importance of being engaged and very active in assisting the growth and the strengthening of Baltimore. So I like to say that we know that Johns Hopkins isn't just in or at Baltimore, but very much of Baltimore. And this past month, we announced a major program where we, as the largest private institution in the state of Maryland and, of course, in the city of Baltimore, are now committing to targeted hiring that will hire 40% of our employees for our entry-level jobs out of the most disadvantaged neighborhoods of Baltimore. We're making clear commitments around the amount of spending on our construction projects that will go to Baltimore businesses, and the same thing with our procurement spend. So we really understand that it's not just enough to share our ideas and our health care with the people of Baltimore, but we've got to be an active agent for economic development.
Healthcare, Hopkins.
One of the things, that you say you're studying is how law enforcement efforts around illegal guns and drugs have affected gun violence in the city. That seems like something that could benefit every police department and every community group that wants to work with their law enforcement, which I would imagine is every city in America. What are some of the early revelations, or what are you seeing there?
So it's early days, but I think there's an appreciation that some of the approaches that we've taken to policing need to be modified, not surprisingly, given what we've been experiencing in Baltimore. And we're working hard on changing norms of community policing, finding ways to build better trust between police and the community. This is something that is really central given the unrest that followed the death of Freddie Gray. So on all these dimensions, what we're trying to do is bring best practices, principles, data to bear on the way in which our police discharge their function, and hoping that that results in benefits for the community.
Is this kind of an evolution in the role of universities in America now that you get more engaged in kind of the local community and issues?
Yes, I think it is. I think there was a time that it was understood that universities' greatest strength and contribution came from their distance from their communities, that they had the capacity to stand apart, to bring principle, data, analytics to bear on issues, and then just write a paper. And that was the way in which we had impact. But I think there's increasingly a recognition that we're large, important actors in our communities, and we have a set of benefits beyond our traditional scholarship that we can bestow on the community. And, again, in a city like Baltimore, where we live in a community where the great jobs that once existed at a place like Bethlehem Steel or General Motors, and one could recite all of the large corporations that have left, in the wake of that, it behooves institutions like Johns Hopkins to play a role in using its capacity to help support the city.
Ron Daniels, congratulations on making it to the top 10.
Congrats.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Doing.
All the best to you. Thank you very much for being on the show. Much more Morning Joe right after this. A new study just out confirms that the scene from the 2012 comedy This Is 40 is kind of like where we are now. Actually, much worse. Some stunning findings about the amount of time American teenagers are spending on video games, TV, and the web. Among the takeaways, teens spend more time on media each day than sleeping. Up to 9 hours a day. Joining us now, Jim Steyer, the founder and CEO of the nonpartisan organization Common Sense Media, which produced the report. It comes out every 5 years.
It does.
Is this the worst grade ever?
No, but think about it. 9 hours a day on average. On average.
What?
Not including time spent in school. So
when do they eat?
That's a good question, but think of your own kids. So if you say there's no way they're spending 9 hours a day, that means they're bringing the national average down to 9 hours a day. And the bottom line is, look, media and technology are literally redefining childhood and adolescence. They're shaping every kid's life in this country. And we, as parents and societal leaders, ignore it at our peril.
Okay, so what can we do about it?
Yeah.
Honestly, first and foremost, as a parent, look in the mirror. Look at your own behavior. I mean, if you're constantly glued to your phone, or you're bringing it to the table, or you're not paying attention to your kid because you're too busy reading your emails or texting somebody, they're going to learn from you. I think that's the first thing you can do. And I think the second thing, I mean, we're all parents. You got to talk to your kids about it. And I think you have to have a very serious conversation about the amount of time spent, what they're doing with it, and also multitasking. Did you guys see the finding on multitasking? 2 out of 3 teenagers multitask while they do their homework because they say it doesn't affect them. Right. So they're reading Shakespeare, but they're also Instagramming their friends.
I remember doing a piece on this back when I was working at CBS, so it must have been in the dark ages. And this multitasking mind of the teen is a real thing, and that's what they do. And there was an argument among some experts that it does not impact their grades.
And guess what? That argument has been debunked since you left CBS and came to Morning
But I was
Joe.
interviewing kids who were going to Harvard and getting great grades, and they were listening to music, doing their homework. They had a box up here and headphones on. And I mean, that was actually the premise of the piece, was this kid.
But I'll tell you, Mika, the truth is we can't multitask.
Yeah. Right. I'm burning out.
You can't multitask and pay attention to 2 things at once and concentrate, and your kids can't either. And actually, some of my Stanford colleagues did the definitive study on this a couple years ago, which makes it clear that multitasking for kids completely interferes with homework. It also, by the way, as we all know, interferes with relationships with other people.
Absolutely.
Because if you're like constantly looking down at your phone and not talking to somebody, it has a big implication for empathy and intimacy in human relationships.
How does this impact their time at school? Because let's be honest, I mean, I know many kids who are that age, my stepkids included, they don't always just put their phone off and turn it off when they're
it's on.
I mean, how do teachers deal with it and cope with situations like that?
You know, it's interesting because we have 100,000 plus member schools at Common Sense Media. That's a different part of the organization. So we encourage the smart use of technology, right? But I'm also a Stanford professor, and I ban laptops in my class. Because I know the kids are not paying attention. They go, oh, too bad. You have to take notes with a pencil. Right. Because I know if they have their pad open or their laptop open, they'll be on Facebook or Instagram, or they'll be sending messages, and therefore they don't pay attention and participate.
But let's assume all of us are doing what we said before, that our kids aren't spending 9 hours. I'm not so sure, but let's assume that. What about the parents who aren't setting that example, who don't see the problem? What are you doing, or what are other organizations doing to try to deal with that?
I mean, Steve, the number one thing we're doing is working through schools. Again, we are the dominant player in the country in teaching digital literacy and citizenship in the United States in all the schools. So most schools in the United States are common sense schools, and we give them a K-12 curriculum about the safe, responsible, smart use of media. So schools is where you can reach all kids. You can also reach parents through schools because you do parent ed with the schools. And in many ways, parents listen to the principal or their kid's teacher as much as they would to us on TV. I think the other thing is this is a national issue that affects all of us. I was at the White House. I totally agree. I was at the White House 2 days ago.
This is the next frontier.
The Obamas have to. We all have kids.
Teaching.
It is.
Relationships.
It is. But the other thing that matters, I think, and Steve being a business leader, is technology industry has a huge role to play here. They should be sending much more clear messages about this. Where are they?
We need to have you back to talk about that angle. I'm serious, and we'll produce around it. Jim Steyer, thank you very much.
Great to see you guys.
It looks like we just got these numbers. Katie Kay, Steve Ratner, Mark Halperin, Bianna Golodriga, all back with us. The monthly jobs reports just crossed. Let's go to CNBC's Sarah Eisen at the New York Stock Exchange. Sarah, how's it look?
Very solid jobs report, Mika. Yeah, the month of October, our economy managed to create 271,000 jobs. Economists were only looking for a number around 180, 183. So this is a big improvement on the month. It's also a big improvement from 2 mediocre jobs reports in September and in August. The pace of hiring is really picking up in this country. The unemployment rate moves down. That's another good sign, 5%. And even better, you guys have been talking about the missing wage growth in this recovery. We're finally starting to see it here a bit. Wages rising a little more than 0.3%. That's a good sign. 9 cents on the month, starting to move in the right direction. And if you really break this jobs report down, a lot of the jobs were created in good industries like services industries, in healthcare. Those are high-paying jobs. Those are good quality jobs. That's what you want to see in this economic recovery. So it is a very good sign on the use of recovery. The one thing I will say is the question on Wall Street today is, how is the Federal Reserve going to look at this number? We know they're itching to raise interest rates from rock bottom zero levels, in fact, hinting that it could come as soon as December. This strong jobs report adds to the case that they can lift interest rates. We are no longer in a crisis. And the question is Wall Street going to be okay with higher interest rates? This is definitely a solid number, guys.
Steve, answer all those questions. And then beyond.
Yeah, look, it's across the board. It's a good number. I would caution, as Sarah did, that we've had 2 disappointing months, and so 1 month doth not a year or a decade or whatever make, especially on the wages front, which is very, very soft. I think the biggest implication of this number is going to be on the Fed, where the odds of an increase in December had dropped to about 30% over the last few weeks, and I think you'll find the odds will go up well over 50%. After this number, I think it really puts the Fed back on track to raise rates in December.
And you know, Janet Yellen had been vocal about the fact that it was still open to raising rates by the end of the year. And what's interesting is there have already been infighting within the Fed about why they shouldn't raise rates. One Fed president yesterday just said, oh, well, a decline in job growth is actually part of the recovery. We should expect that. Obviously, we saw a much better number today, so it'll be interesting to see how that works out.
Beyond though, I'm confused because the news we've been getting from the GDP numbers recently has not been good. It suggests that actually the recovery might be a bit more fragile than we'd all been thinking a few months ago. So how does this change that?
Yet another element that the Fed is taking into consideration as well. I was actually speaking with somebody yesterday who suggested that we could be seeing 1.5% to 2% growth for the foreseeable future. Obviously not great news, but with a number like this, the key will be to see if it continues in the months ahead.
And part of why you're having slow growth in the economy and fast growth in jobs is because productivity hasn't been that strong, and in the long run that's actually not a good thing. In the short run it puts more people to work. But let me just mention one thing about the job situation that is starting to get more attention among economists, but not as much, and this bears on the politics of it. We have a lower percentage of men between 25 and 54, prime men, working than almost all the European countries with their much higher employment rates. We have a lower percentage of prime women working than Japan, which you don't think of as a hotbed of women's employment. We have had huge dropouts from our labor force, and in fact, in this latest number, doesn't show them coming back. And so you've got a large group of people out there who, for whatever reason, dropped out of the labor force but are still in the political system voting for people.
If you assume there's going to be a rate increase, what's the range of possibility and how will they decide?
Will almost certainly be 1/4 point. I think they have set up everybody to expect 1/4 point. And you'll say, or you should say, obviously that's not a lot. But what it is